Welcome to the first of the Interspiritual Agnostics and Seekers interview series. It's my true pleasure to welcome Noah Rasheta. He's the founder and host of the Secular Buddhism podcast. He's also a teacher trained in Buddhism, and we just want to welcome Noah. The website is www.secularbuddhism.com.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to join you guys for this discussion.
Hey, Noah. My name is Kunal Kambapuri, and I'm here with Bill Eckert and Mark Hoffman, and we're representing a group called Interspiritual Agnostics and Seekers. We are very active on Facebook, and I'll start with just kind of introducing the origin of the group, particularly its name. I'll take the credit for coining the term spiritual agnosticism back in 2007. There were a couple of uses of that term already, but in a very different context. And I was very young, but and just forming my ideas about spirituality. And what I brought to the table was a point of view that emphasizes the common values shared between different religions and people of no religion. And I wanted to make an attempt of some sort to bridge the gap between atheists and people who belong to a religion, people who belong to no religion, etc. And it boils down to this very simple idea that your actions, your attitude, the way you treat people are much more important than the things you believe in. So as long as we leave a little room for doubt in our minds, then no matter what we believe, we have the potential to come together. That's the agnosticism part of it. And agnosticism, we were just talking about, is a little bit of an inaccessible term, but it's really just that we can have our own beliefs, but we can also be respectful of other people's point of view and have a little room for doubt. You can be an agnostic atheist, or you can be an agnostic Christian. There's no conflict there. So you can be a person of multiple faiths even, and this isn't a novel concept at all, far from it. I quoted people like Gandhi and Krishnamurti and others, and all I really did was give it a name and a description, which I thought it needed. And I pulled together some related ideas in the hopes that one day there would be some kind of community built around common values like love, and that a diverse and inclusive community like that, a respectful community, would search for common values together. Bill Eckert is the one who turned that vision into a reality. I'll let him speak to that.
So before I, jump into that, I want to say just a tiny bit about my own background. So I didn't grow up in the church, but my mom was Catholic, my dad was Protestant in how they were brought up. And as far back as I remember anything, I remember some senses of spirituality, some senses of doubt, particularly about God and the Bible. So for me, the tension between spirituality and doubt runs through all of my life. Through college, I got to a point where I really wanted to be rid of one or the other. I wanted to be rid of my doubt or rid of my sense of spirituality or longing for belief or, pondering the deep questions without answers. And then in graduate school, I basically achieved that, so I thought, where I rid myself of belief and became a pretty militant agnostic atheist. And I started, frequenting online agnostic and atheist groups, and that served me well for a while. A lot of ranting against religion and that sort of thing. But eventually I learned it got old. I needed something more, and the kind of community that Kunal was just talking about. I thought, I was after graduate school sort of re-emerging this sense of spirituality that I just couldn't understand why, I'm still worried about these things. And so then I thought, I need a place to talk about this the times I did go to church, there was no one to talk to, about doubts or questions. The agnostic and atheist groups, all they wanted to do was bash religion. So I thought we need a place where people could just freely discuss anything. And so our group is really, there's about 2,000 members covering a wide range of people. Some are very classical agnostics that don't really lean towards God or away from God. And there are agnostic theists and deists and agnostic atheists. Some people would consider themselves agnostic atheists with respect to some definitions of God, but are open to other definitions. So I'll turn it over to Mark to introduce himself a bit.
Thank you. My name is Mark Hoffman, and before anything, I'd like to say what a privilege is to be part of this group. I mean, I don't know how I fell into this group. I mean, it's clouded in some history, but I was then recruited as an admin, and I've been very, very happy. I think it's a very special group. Personally, I'm Jewish, and in the Dawkins scale, I guess what qualifies as an agnostic atheist, but I think these are just nosology. These are just arbitrary terms and fluid, and people flux, I think, within the group between, one thing and another. I think, so for me, probably the biggest trigger for becoming agnostic atheist is my profession as an oncologist, because I think I've witnessed more suffering than I would ever want anybody to do. And yet I've helped so many, but I've seen the depths of suffering that theists have gone through. And I'm being amazed that they retain their faith. So that, I think, was a big trigger for me. Other than that, I had a very good Jewish education, but I've always had my doubts about a higher power. And it crystallized yesterday when I posted that I now consider myself no longer a believer in a higher power whatsoever. And I'm also seeking, I read extensively existentialism, humanism, other literature, because I'm basically seeking and still looking for a belief system. I'm an amateur astronomer, so I appreciate that there are things bigger than themselves. And also know I've read, I listened to 5 of your podcasts as well. So I look forward to, this interview.
So Noah, before we unpack the details of, exactly what Buddhism is and secular Buddhism, could you just give us some background about your spiritual journey, where you started from and how you got to where you are?
Sure. Yeah, so my name is Noah Rasheta, and my background, growing up, I grew up in an LDS household, Mormon faith, and combined with Catholicism. So my mom's side of the family were very Catholic. My dad was the first to convert to Mormonism, followed by my mom, but without necessarily leaving Catholicism totally behind, at least culturally. And I grew up in my early years were in Texas, and then our family moved to Mexico when I was young. So my schooling was private Catholic schools growing up. And that's why I kind of retained a little bit of both of those upbringings, with Catholicism and then Mormonism as the predominant ideology in our home. That led to later in life feeling that little bit of a tug of which one is the more correct one, because there was, at least from the Mormon perspective, and perhaps from the Catholic one as well, there is one correct path and others are not the correct path. So I felt that tug, and I felt that inner turmoil of wanting to know with certainty which path was the correct path. And I think that mental exploration is what eventually led me away from both of those traditions and led me to Buddhism, which was more of a space of uncertainty and not knowing, and becoming more comfortable with just knowing that life itself is so uncertain. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I know what could happen, what might not happen, but then there's the whole box of I can't even imagine things that could or couldn't happen. And I wasn't comfortable with that in my early years. I think myself, and perhaps it's a human thing, but we just want to know. And I kind of transitioned from a very theist position where I knew that I had the right beliefs, to a form of atheism where I again felt a sense of certainty that I knew that it was nothing, and then drifted back to where I realized that was, for me, it felt like two sides of the same coin, and I was grasping to a sense of certainty when the only thing that made sense to me was uncertainty and not knowing. So I like the term that you mentioned, Kunal, with spiritual agnosticism, or agnostic spirituality. It's something that in my mind makes a lot of sense. It's the idea that life is so big, there's so much that we don't know, and it's kind of nice to know that you can't know. I don't know what day I'm going to die or how I'm going to die. I may know that I will die. Maybe that part of it's certain, but there's just so much certainty in there. What will it be like when my kids are teenagers? What will it be like lose a job, or so many factors that are just unknowns. And I'm kind of now finding myself in a place where I'm just more open to the uncertainty of where it'll all go. So that's what led me to where I am now. I think it was the proverbial long night of the dark night of the soul, I think is the expression.
Yeah.
Wrestling with my beliefs and the certainty of my beliefs, and ending up in a place where I kind of just gave up the search for certainty and thought, I'm going to try to be more comfortable with the uncertainty of life and just not knowing and going along for the ride. So that's kind of where I am now.
Right. Thank you so much. No, I couldn't agree more. I think that kind of comfort with ambiguity and uncertainty, it makes a lot of sense if you're trying to understand the world, and it's such a practical thing for that reason.
It's
So,
honest, to just truly admit to yourself, I don't know. And it can be freeing and scary too.
Yeah, one of the first concepts that I encountered that attracted me to Buddhism was the story of the six blind men and the elephant, and the idea that you can have different people describing the same object from different perspectives, and nobody's entirely right and nobody's entirely wrong. It's just we're all blinded by where we stand in space and time. That really spoke to me because I thought there was somehow a way to have a complete picture, but I realized that there can't be a complete picture because you can't ever be all of the perspectives at once, and that gave me a greater appreciation for the religions that at the time I was wanting to push away. I started to see them as, well, that's just where you're standing and how you're seeing it. So what can your explanation do for me to help me increase my perspective of the elephant that I'll never fully see and appreciate, because I'll never be big enough to encompass that. I'll always be standing wherever I'm standing and only seeing whatever I'm limited to be able to see.
it's a beautiful analogy for the great unknown, like a great ocean or an elephant.
But Noah, I would add though, what we did recently is we changed the name of the group to Agnostic and Seekers. I mean, Bill talks about agnosticism v.2, and I think it's an important epithet that we added because, we're not, agnosticism could be considered an almost stagnant position. You don't know and you're never going to know. And I think that we all feel that that's not enough. We have a finite lifespan. Do we want to sit here and just say we don't know, or do we want to say maybe we'll never know, but we want to know? And I think that that's a really nice part of the group. Right, Bill? You even asked a question, what are you seeking, in one of the posts? And people are looking, people, yes, some are probably classically agnostic, but I think people are really looking for meaning. I'm very big on meaning from existentialists, but people are looking beyond the agnostic position. So I just want to make that point as well.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. That's one of the things that I realized as I was becoming a little more humble out of my militant agnosticism and atheism is that I don't know that I can't know, right? You know, some agnostics go so far as to say, I don't know and you don't know and we can never know. But I didn't even know that. So then maybe it is worth seeking, you know, and even, you know, logically, whether it is or isn't, you know, as I described before, I just felt it within me, you know, that I just have this sense of wanting to seek and know. And, you know, honestly, you know, as a scientist, the more I learn, the more I see there's a lot we don't know. You know, we describe in science what matter and energy do, but we really don't know what they are. You know, that's a really big philosophical question of what is matter, what is energy, and then, you know, dark energy, you know, that's supposed to be 97% of all of reality, and we have no empirical data for it. You know, we don't know what it is. So even science can lead you to humility.
Yeah, and I think that once you kind of hit the limits of what you can intuit from within your own perspective, you know, what's next? You can learn from other people's perspectives and maybe even form a community to better do that.
Right.
And that's part of what we're trying to do here is, you know, we're going to reach out to a broad range of people, you know, that have some kind of spirituality or even psychology, you know, something that can be of benefit. And, you know, the image that we have in the group is from the Dalai Lama, where he said, my religion is very simple. My religion is kindness. And that's one thing, you know, that rather than defining myself as an agnostic, you know, I am a seeker. I'm seeking to learn how to be more kind to myself and others. And that sort of is part of what made me reach out to your podcast. You know, I've listened to every single one of them. And, you know, as you say every time, don't take what you learn from Buddhism to be a Buddhist, take it to be a better whatever you already are. And that, you know, I don't like labels. I don't even like the label agnostic, you know, but that's what I'm trying to do is just be a better version of me and to know, you know, more, as much as I can know.
Why don't we talk about what it is to be a Buddhist?
I think this is a good time. So Noah, could you, you know, just some of our members are very familiar with Buddhism. I think many not, and, you know, maybe start with the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path.
Sure. So Buddhism, for me, from my perspective, one of my favorite quotes I've heard was from Dr. Mark Epstein in one of his books. I can't remember which one. Was asked, what is the difference between a Buddhist and a non-Buddhist? And his answer was, the non-Buddhist thinks there's a difference. And that always stuck with me. I'm also uncomfortable with labels. And I think over the years, I've become even more uncomfortable with even using the term Buddhist, just because it separates you from, well, then what does that mean? And what is a non-Buddhist? And, you know, but I'll tell you what it means to me as a practitioner. It's essentially the set of tools that have allowed me to understand me better, the nature of my own mind, why I say and think and do the things that I do. Now, certainly Buddhism is on the list of world religions, right? It's certainly a thing that's out there that can be defined, and yet the definition is controlled by a lot of different people. In the same way that if we tried to define agnosticism or atheism or Christianity, you know, is it the Mormon perspective, the Catholic perspective, the Jehovah's Witnesses? They would all explain Christianity a little bit differently, and Buddhism is going to be similar between the various schools of Buddhism. But what seems to be pretty common to most schools of Buddhism are some of the basic foundational teachings. Would be the teachings of the Four Noble Truths, which is the truth of suffering, the truth of the causes of suffering, the truth of the cessation of suffering, and the truth of the path that leads to the cessation of suffering. So I think in its most basic definition, Buddhism is a tradition that focuses heavily on the elimination of suffering, or perhaps more appropriately, an elimination of the causes of suffering.
I know,
Now,
Mark.
of course, there's a whole bunch that can be unpacked at that point, but that I think is the essence of it.
I know Mark has a question about suffering.
I have multiple questions, but I'm going to start by introduction again and say I'm an oncologist and I take care of people who are afflicted by a malevolent disease. And when we talk about suffering in patients with cancer, there are multiple domains of suffering. So it's not one particular, suffering is a construct, there's more than one domain. So we talk about global suffering, which I'm going to get into in my next question. But my first question is, the first noble truth certainly is valid in that it says all individuals are destined to suffer in some way. And I think that is true to all degree. And certainly my patients are severely suffering in the context of having advanced cancer. But the first noble truth to me has the tenor of resignation, in the sense that everybody is going to suffer and therefore it is what it is. And I don't get the sense that it's going to segue into this feeling of I'm going to proactively respond to it or cope with it in some way. You know, you get the sense that a Buddhist would say, I'm suffering, it's inevitable, I must resign myself to it, as opposed to I'm suffering, I need to find a way to cope and try to alleviate it. So my question to you, Noah, is my perception correct? Is the Buddhist outlook, or is the Buddhist outlook too passive?
So I think for most people who are familiar with Buddhism would also be familiar with the notion of there being varying degrees or types of suffering. It's always going to be problematic to take a concept translated and then have a word like suffering, for example, as the word that ends up being the one word that defines that first noble truth. The original word dukkha, which is the word that's used to talk about suffering, has been translated to many other words. Anguish, for example. One of the ways that I like to talk about it is it's what arises when we want things to be other than how they are. And the essence of the first noble truth is that in life, difficulties arise. And when we want things to be other than how they are, that thing that we feel while we're experiencing that is what Buddhism is dealing with. It's not suffering in the sense of pain. Probably one of the first things that you would learn in studying Buddhism and studying suffering is the distinction between, I guess, what we could call natural suffering and self-inflicted suffering. So the pain that arises from a broken arm, or the pain that arises from the loss of a loved one, those are very natural forms of suffering. But what we're concerned with in Buddhism as a practice is distinguishing the much more hard to tell suffering that arises through views. For example, if I have the view that says smart people never mess up, and then I mess up, and all of you saw that I messed up, I feel this feeling inside of pain that arises through a belief, which is the belief that I'm not supposed to be someone who looks like they just messed up. That is the type of suffering that we're trying to identify in Buddhist practice, to recognize where did that belief come from, and how is that leading to a pain that's totally self-inflicted? Because if I didn't have the belief, I wouldn't have the pain, or I wouldn't have that suffering. So that's kind of the difference in my perspective when we're talking about suffering from Buddhism. It's the self-inflicted suffering that arises from conditioning, not the suffering that arises from natural things like loss or pain.
So actually, no.
Go ahead, Mark.
Because that really segues into my question, because we talked about well, now you clearly explained it, that the emphasis on Buddhism is more on this discord, what is it I wrote down here, which I think refers to the Dhammapada states: from craving springs grief, from craving springs fear. Excuse me if I'm mistranslating or missaying any of this. For him who is wholly free from craving, there is no grief. So that kind of suffering seems to be the core emphasis in Buddhist practice. But what I'm asking from my standpoint is, there's a lot of natural suffering going on. There's a lot of physical suffering. There's a lot of emotional suffering. And there's a lot of existential suffering. Are those considered outside of the purview of Buddhist practice, or only part of advanced training? Noah?
From my perspective, it would be considered outside of the practice, and in many ways unskillful to even attempt to eliminate that form of suffering. Just using an example, craving similarly to suffering, there's natural craving, and then there's craving that arises due to conditioning or beliefs. Natural craving would be what my body is craving when I'm thirsty, right? Now, for me to sit there and try to eliminate the pangs of thirst, that's not very skillful, because my body's going to experience that. That's what a human body does. So again, for me, the practice would be focused on, first of all, separating or isolating my two buckets of natural craving, unnatural craving, or craving that's skillful or unskillful. I like using that as the delineation between, instead of good or bad, I think skillful and unskillful. So unskillful craving leads to unskillful suffering. And that's where I'm focusing. That's where I have found that most forms of Buddhism focus heavily on is unskillful craving, unskillful suffering, because that can be eliminated. There's very little or no emphasis on even trying to eliminate what could be called skillful suffering or skillful craving.
So I want to bring a question up related to this, in how you might apply Buddhist ideas to oncology, for example. So, is what you're saying that, if a patient craves, desires to be rid of cancer, that you should make effort to do that, but when it gets to a point where the cancer is not going to go away by anything that medical science is able to do, then at that point it would be unskillful to wish it were other than it is.
I don't think that, but that's not what that was not my understanding. My understanding was what was alluded to as craving was not that kind of concept of craving to the end. I think Noah said that's outside of purview, that kind of suffering. It's more the kind of craving between wanting things that are inappropriate or unachievable for us. Correct me if I'm wrong, Noah, that it's that kind of suffering that the practice is dealing with. Is that correct? That was my takeaway.
Yeah, that is correct. But it also holds in there the general formula that the suffering arises from the craving. It's so using cancer as the example, if I have cancer and I really wish that I didn't have cancer, I'm going to experience a level of suffering that arises simply from wanting things to be other than how they are. And that's okay. That's not necessarily the problem. It's fine to crave, even if I crave, if I know this and I know this formula and I study Buddhism, and now I say, okay, well, I want to not want things to be other than how they are. I can't get out of that trap. I'm still stuck there wanting. So it's not necessarily, from the Buddhist perspective, it's not suffering that's the problem. It would be identifying and understanding in my craving, my habitual patterns. Is this a skillful thing? Can I continue with this, or could this shed light on something else, and I could focus my energy on a different form of craving that is manageable, like, I don't know, switching to a different type of medicine or a different type of treatment that might be more effective. So if we go back to the Four Noble Truths and think of them as tasks, Stephen Batchelor kind of talks about this. And I really like this because the emphasis is so heavily focused on suffering, right? Suffering, the craving, the cessation, and then the path. But when we look at these as tasks, it's the focus goes to the last one, which is action. So the if you look at them as tasks, you'd think that the first one is to embrace the instance of suffering, which is essentially recognizing this is how things are. Okay, that's how they are. Next, you go to the second one would be like letting go of the reactivity. The third one would be seeing the stopping of the reactivity, putting that gap in between how things are unfolding and the stories that I'm creating around all of it, which leads me to the fourth one, which is act skillfully. And I like it when the emphasis is put on the end on act skillfully, because then Buddhism kind of becomes this tool set that it's not so much about eliminating suffering. It's about how can I act more skillfully with whatever comes next, more skillfully than I have been. And it's not skillful in the sense of, well, here's the skillful thing and here's the unskillful thing. No, it's just on the scale of this is this much more skillful than it would have been had I not been practicing. That would have been, one step less skillful. It can be one step more skillful. Well, that's better than it would have been. And that to me seems like a very practical way to approach all of this.
Yeah, it's so easy to mix those things up because Buddhism in general deals with seeing the world more clearly. So you look at the Four Noble Truths and the description of suffering, it appears that it's focused on an epistemology of sorts, or maybe not an epistemology, but a description of the world. But what you're saying is that the more important takeaway is that it's a skill set, not a philosophy as such.
Yeah, that's definitely how I view it. And that's why it seems like such a beneficial practice, because it's just another skill set in the, to put in your toolbox of skills to deal with life.
That actually brings me to my first question. I'm going to keep it really simple. What is holiness in Buddhism? Because I see things like His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, who I have a lot of respect for, but it just makes me curious. What is holiness in Buddhism and in secular Buddhism?
That's a good question. It's not a term that I encounter often in Buddhism. In Tibetan Buddhism, yes, especially referring to the Dalai Lama as His Holiness the Dalai Lama. To be honest, I'm not sure what most Buddhists would, at least Tibetan Buddhists, would say that means holiness. Now, in Buddhism in general, there's the term of holiness in the sense of being whole, the sense of being complete or at one with the suchness of things. So there's a sense that holiness, at least in the tradition that I studied, which is influenced by Japanese Pure Land Buddhism, holiness would be very related to completeness. You talked about, Kunal, in Buddhism, there's this emphasis to see things clearly. And that's the first in the Eightfold Path is right view or skillful view. And to see something clearly, you could say in the Buddhist sense, is to see something holy, to see something as it really is. So perhaps referring to the Dalai Lama, it could be a form of paying respect to this person who likely sees things much more clearly than other people, but it's not holy in the sense of the Judeo-Christian view where you opposite of holiness, you have like, I don't know, sinfulness or something, or it's not in that sense. It's more in the sense of a completeness or more clear, more accurate, something along those lines.
The Dalai Lama walks into a pizza shop and he asks, "Can you make me one with everything?"
I like that one.
Yeah.
In other words, can you make me a holy pizza?
Right. No, this discussion has been pretty focused on Buddhism in general, For those who aren't really familiar with secular Buddhism, can you, briefly describe what the differences are between secular Buddhism and, I know there's several schools of Buddhism, so, it might be hard to generalize it, but what's the general difference between Buddhism and secular Buddhism?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's something that's currently being defined, I think. The secular Buddhist movement is relatively new. And from my understanding, or at least the way that I view it, I don't see it as something that's separate from Buddhism or as a different form of Buddhism. I see it more as a personal approach to practicing or studying Buddhism. The secular approach for me is with an emphasis on taking Buddhist concepts and ideas and being able to apply them as a philosophy or as a way of life without necessarily having to delve into the cultural or more religious feeling aspects of it. Some of the practices can feel religious, lighting incense or chanting, praying with beads, only because I approached it from the and saw it through that lens, and it didn't mean the same thing to me that it meant to somebody who probably practices that. So for me, there was no interest in delving into the ritualistic aspects of the practice. There was only the interest in the concepts and ideas and the teachings. So I called it secular Buddhism originally, I think, as a way for me to try to stand out as I'm approaching this new religion, but not as a religion. I didn't know really what to call it. I think in a way to protect myself from the judgment of family and friends and my community here, a very religious community. I didn't want to say I'm studying Buddhism, but it felt comfortable to say I'm exploring secular Buddhism or non-religious Buddhism, whatever that meant at the time. And now it's kind of evolved into, I'm kind of stuck with that term, but I don't know that I'm even comfortable with that either. But yeah, I think to answer your question, for me, the secular Buddhism, as opposed to Buddhism, would just be someone who's interested in exploring the non-religious aspects of Buddhism that don't feel like they're involved with anything supernatural or anything metaphysical or anything that even feels like a religious practice.
So if you remove the metaphysical and religious aspects of Buddhism, would you say what remains, in terms of the skill set that we've talked about, is it essentially psychology and ethics?
I think there's a considerable overlap, but there are certain concepts that come out of Buddhism that I don't see in psychology and that I don't see in just typical conversations around ethics. And I think that that continues to draw me to Buddhism as a whole because of the stories, the parables, the koans, the several concepts that I only know of through Buddhism. So, yeah.
Yeah, I want to ask you about morality. And I'll start with a little story of something that I was thinking about almost exactly 10 years ago, just maybe a couple of weeks off. I was thinking of what Alan Watts was saying about basically how any logical assertion or definition that you can make has a kind of contradiction to it. And both the assertion and the contradiction are really two sides of the same coin. You're thinking of them as opposites, you're thinking of them together, they have shared assumptions, a system in your mind that's taking place. And then even above that, that can be thought of as a concept, that larger context. And then that concept could have a contradiction, and then that larger context and the contradiction could also be thought of as two sides of the same coin. And you get larger and larger contexts that you're thinking of. So I was seeing those broader contexts, and I was trying to visualize this hierarchy. I was aware that thoughts and feelings are intimately connected and that they exist together, not separately. So uh, each concept that exists as one side of a coin is also wrapped together with perceptions, feelings, etc., or what I call motivation. So if you have a hierarchy of thoughts and concepts, you also have a hierarchy of motivations. And that might even be less confusing to think about, just the simple motivations. And I arrived at love as being this highest motivation. I felt at one with people who had kind of realized the importance of love before me. Like I finally understood that, oh my goodness, the answer is love. Uh, but I wanted to refine that idea to decide what exactly it is that I'm trying to say about it. Uh, I've thought of it in different ways: humility, open-mindedness, respect, kindness, compassion, empathy. All of these, I think, go together. Uh, what they really have in common is that they involve uh, thinking about a possibility that could exist beyond your own perception or imagination. Um, kind of thinking about things beyond your own perspective. But there's a problem with that, which is uh, that it's not necessarily the most important thing you should be thinking about skillfully, as we're saying, in every single moment, right? There are plenty of people who would say, well, sometimes you got to look out for yourself. You can't be thinking about humility at every single moment in your life. Like, well, what is that? That's nonsense. I mean, it could be admirable and extraordinary. Um, but I was trying to think, what is it then that I am trying to say? What is this hierarchy anyway? What is the thesis or the point? Um, so I think what's to get back to what these motivations have in common, seeing beyond your perspective. Uh, I came to this answer that even though humility and open-mindedness and love, it might not be the most important thing to think about at every single moment, it underlies our entire way of seeing the world. So it has what I call the broadest range of applicability, or the maybe the widest range of use cases. So if we learn lessons throughout our lives and forget lessons, we have to have some kind of prioritization that says this is what we definitely shouldn't forget as we're learning. This is what we should keep in the back of our minds as a little nugget of truth to consider, because there's always the possibility that what we're thinking about is completely wrong, or that we're completely missing something, that our blind spots are important in a way that we don't understand. Um, that makes me think of morality and what we were saying earlier. Do you use these motivations, these common motivations, as a form of morality? Is that part of Buddhism and secular Buddhism? And how does that relate to what you were saying about the Judeo-Christian alternative of this is the right way to view things and other ways are wrong? What is morality in Buddhism, secular Buddhism?
Yeah, that's a good question and a fascinating topic, right? That could be explored and unpacked for months and years. Um, the So two concepts that come to mind from Buddhism that I think correlate to this topic. One is skillful means, right? I think the emphasis and so much of Buddhist practice is focuses around skillful means and finding, recognizing that what might be skillful under one set of circumstances or scenarios is not under another. So rather than assigning like the generic, okay, these are the good things or these are the bad things, it would be developing the ability to make that assessment based on whatever given set of circumstances you might be in. For example, lying, right? Like rather than saying, okay, lying is wrong, which seems like on the surface makes total sense. And in Buddhism, there's on the Eightfold Path, there's a topic specifically about this and the way we communicate with others. But what about in the instance that you're hiding a refugee in your house and the Nazis come knocking to, to take them or something. Well, then in that case, lying would be the moral thing to do. So again, the emphasis would be on being able to have the tool set in your internal assessment of things at any given moment to be skillful and go off of what is the skillful thing to do. So that's skillful means is a thing in Buddhism. And then the other thing that arises as a concept quite commonly in Buddhism is the middle way, the recognition that the extremes are not that they're the wrong way, but there's always the middle way too. And under one set of circumstances, this extreme might seem to be what makes sense, but there's also the middle way in between the two. And again, because of the perspective in Buddhism of constant change, impermanence, things being in a constant state of change, and all things being interdependent. So impermanence and interdependence kind of influence the overall worldview of Buddhism. Because of the implication of things being impermanent, things being interdependent, we wouldn't want to have a set answer in terms of morality, because it could change. If I'm seeing the elephant from this side and you're seeing it from that side, or the morality may seem like it's different, but it's not. This is what makes sense because of this is where I am here now. And that makes sense because that's where you are there and then, or something to that effect. Which, that's kind of the general view, but I think that opens up a whole can of worms as well.
Right.
But that's what's great, to be able to openly talk. And that's why I think communities like what you guys are building and fostering are so important, because rather than setting ourselves in stone and saying this is this and that is that, we're all saying, but is it? The agnosticism, I think, is really important there, and being able to say, well, help me understand what you're seeing because I'm not seeing it, and let me help you understand what I'm seeing.
Yeah, personally, I agree with you, but I've had many conversations with people who think I'm totally wrong, that the role of the individual should not come first in determining what is the quote unquote best way, but you believe that there is an important role of the individual in determining that for ourselves.
Yeah, I think there is. And to what degree, I don't know. When it comes to morality, I often think about, you mentioned before concepts, right? All of these concepts that we have, morality as a concept, we created that. So let's just remove ourselves real quickly from the equation and say there are no humans on Earth. How would I judge the moral bird versus the immoral bird? It's like, well, suddenly it doesn't make sense. Morality almost, what is an immoral lion, right? There's no such thing. But we can do it with humans. I can tell you what an immoral human would do and what a moral human would do. So then it leaves me in that state of, well, is it really what I think it is? It may still feel like the right thing, but that doesn't mean that it is the right thing. And that's kind of where I sit with it. I mean, I certainly have views of morality that feel right to me, but I don't necessarily hang on to them as truths, because I don't know why it makes sense to me, but it just does. But that doesn't mean that it's right. For example, I would feel very uncomfortable to sneak into your house and steal from you. Does that mean that it's wrong? I don't know, but I'm not going to do it. It doesn't have to be a moral truth to still prevent me from doing it, because it doesn't seem like the skillful thing to do.
But Noah,
Oh, go ahead, Mark.
Well, isn't the Eightfold Path essentially a moral code?
Yeah, you could say it's somewhat of a moral code. I think from the Buddhist perspective, it would be, again, a set of skillful means. The translation used is sometimes right, like right speech, right action. But another translation that I think to me speaks a little bit more, makes more sense is wise or skillful. What is the skillful view to have? What is a wise view to have? Wise action. But yeah, it does serve somewhat as the basic Buddhist outline of the path to try to live by to achieve less suffering in the world for ourselves and for others.
I think that right action and right speech and all that, do you think of that in terms of art at all? That living is a form of art and expression, and there's choice in that, and you're presenting something and you're deciding what is right.
I'm not sure I understand what you mean.
I'm not sure either.
No, Noah, just to continue the theme of the Eightfold Path, did we discuss it at any point, just for our group, people who are not familiar with Buddhism? I'm not sure that we actually discussed this Eightfold Path.
He went over the Four Noble Truths.
So I thought that would be important to elaborate on, because that is. So could you tell us exactly what that Eightfold? In other words, my conception of it was not just a way of averting suffering. I thought it on a broader scope is like a code of conduct. So do you want to talk about it and what it is, that Eightfold Path?
Sure. So the Eightfold Path, kind of in a nutshell, pertains to 8 different things in life. It's if you wanted to visualize this in Buddhism, there's the wheel with the 8 spokes. Those 8 spokes of the wheel represent the Eightfold Path. So these are kind of the 8 areas in your life that you could work on or focus on to have a more complete, right? Again, using holy in the sense of complete, you can picture a wheel with 8 spokes. Works a lot more skillfully the wheel that's missing a section, and it's kind of clunking as it rolls. So it's I think that's a nice way to visualize it. But the 8 aspects of this path would be wise view or right view, right intention, right speech, right conduct, right livelihood, the way we go about living, effort, right mindfulness, and right meditation or mindfulness. It's, I think, a more common translation of the last one, right mindfulness. And then, of course, you can dive into each of those, but those are kind of the 8 areas that we focus on in our practice from a Buddhist perspective.
So I'm glad you brought up meditation. This comes up quite frequently in the group, and none of us are really experts on meditation, and the question often is, what's the best forms of meditation? What apps should I use, or whatever? And do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah. With meditation, I mean, there are so many forms, right? Thousands of forms of meditation. But I do want to say, from the Buddhist perspective, the key benefit of meditation is it's essentially the go-to tool to help combat habitual reactivity. And that is the understanding that we go about life in reactive mode. This happens, so I think that. Because I think that, now I feel this. Because I feel this, now I do that. And there I go, right? Just reactivity mode. Meditation comes in as this powerful tool to help us get out of the habitual reactivity and for a moment practice being the observer. I think the most basic form of meditation common in Buddhism is observing our breath and being able to pause for a moment, get out of the habitual reactivity of the mind that's jumping from thought to feeling to emotion to action to thought to back and forth like that, to one that simply observes. And you start with observing one of the most basic things. What do I observe in my breathing? And you can focus on the tip of your nose, for example. And as you breathe in and out of your nose, what do you sense there? Temperature fluctuation between the in-breath and the out-breath, or the physical sensation of the chest as it rises and falls with each in and out breath. And it may seem like such a simple thing, like, well, what's that doing? What does that even do for me? Why am I going to sit there and do that? Well, what it does for you is, for a moment, you're not in the reactivity mode. You're just in observer mode. And the observer mode is a very powerful mode to be in, especially when you're experiencing a strong emotion. It's the difference of recognizing, while I'm experiencing anger, that I can observe that I'm experiencing anger. And in that gap, in that moment of observing that I'm experiencing the emotion, I might not have to do the reactive thing, which could be punching the wall, and now the wall's broken and my hand hurts. But I didn't have to reach that because I was okay with just observing, wow, I'm experiencing anger, and feeling it and really being with it. You practice that with meditation. That's where that starts. So that's my little pitch on meditation in its most basic form, and why it's even a beneficial practice.
Excellent.
No, that's great. Thank you.
One practical takeaway, what would you choose?
Say that again.
If you had to choose one practical takeaway for somebody who's a seeker, or person of multiple faiths, or a person of faith, or a person of no faith, what would be the one practical takeaway that you would choose for them?
From meditation?
But from this conversation, from secular Buddhism, from Buddhism, from you personally, if you had to give them a piece of advice.
I think it would be the first big piece of advice that I think was extremely impactful for me as I encountered Buddhism. And that is the most schools of thought out there, religions, ideologies, focus on the answers, right? We kind of go through life and with a lot of uncertainty, and we're looking for answers to this or that. And Buddhism is one of those unique ones that doesn't focus on the answers. It focuses heavily on the question. Where does the question come from? Where does the need to know come from? So I can be a seeker, and what Buddhism will do to me is say, okay, that's great, be a seeker, but seek the one who's seeking. Where does the seeking come from? Why am I seeking? Why is seeking even important? So as I went through this, transitioning from being a truth seeker to eventually just being a seeker of the experiences as they unfold. Like, I don't even know what I'm seeking now. I'm just curious about this experience of being alive, and that's enough. So I think, Kunal, getting back to your what you brought up, I think it would be that, like, if you're going to put X amount of energy into seeking or putting energy into finding the answers, try to allot the same amount of energy to the questions themselves. Why do the questions matter? Where does the question come from? Who's the one doing the questioning? Because I think there's a fascinating exploration that can happen on that side of the equation as well. The one that's looking inward versus looking outward.
Reminds me of a joke that Alex Trebek once made. He said, all of life's answers must be phrased in the form of a question.
Yeah.
I never really understood that, but I think that you just shed some excellent light on that. Seek the seeker, and try to understand what question it is that you yourself are asking.
Yeah, I guess that would be part of right intention, or I guess trying to understand your intentions.
Yeah. It's funny with what you just mentioned, Kunal. I think it was Alan Watts that I heard once making this joke or talking about this concept that if you could present yourself to God, and you can only ask one question, what would that question be? And the only when you really think through it, like, the only logical question that makes sense is to ask him what would be the best question. So it doesn't answer the question. It leaves you with, what you would get is you'd be right back where you started. Now you would know the question, but you just used up your one question. And I love that loop that we're stuck in, because that to me is reality. That would be the one question to ask God. What is the best question to ask you? And there you
So,
go. You blew it.
Noah, we're about out of time, but I wanted to see if there's, anything that you would like to add, that maybe we didn't cover, or, just any final thoughts. It's been really interesting, I think, for us, and we hope for you too, and that, our members will find it valuable.
One concept that I think I'd like to share. It's always been one of my favorite concepts from Buddhism, is the concept of, or the notion of, groundlessness. And this one speaks a lot to me because of my personal hobbies. I practice paragliding. I teach paragliding, and I think we go through life and we stand on these. We stand on foundations that seem firm to us, whatever your firm foundation is. And life is comfortable when your foundation seems solid, but the moment it starts to crumble, a cancer diagnosis, the loss of a loved one, you start questioning your faith, that foundation starts to crumble, and suddenly life gets really uncomfortable. And from the Buddhist perspective, there's this beautiful thing that happens when you learn to stand have no ground to stand on. The concept of groundlessness is that when you don't need to have a firm foundation to stand on, then nothing can ruffle your feathers, because your firm foundation is no firm foundation. And in paragliding, that's kind of what we do, right? We learn to take that leap off of the cliff, and then, as terrifying as it can be, it ends up being the thing that we do to go seek joy. It's such a fun and rewarding thing to do, but you can't do it while you're standing on the ground. You've got to step into groundlessness. And that's become kind of my elevator pitch about Buddhism as a practice. It's stepping into groundlessness with reality and allowing myself to become comfortable with the discomfort of not knowing, and allowing myself, I don't have anything to stand on. I don't know the answer to anything. I have anything that felt certain at one point in life is totally gone. There is no certainty. And that is what makes life so beautiful. The uniqueness of every moment. I won't get to live this moment again. The equanimity of the emotions I experience as I'm on this ride. I just lost my dad to cancer a couple months ago. And I was very grateful for the equanimity I was feeling, that this is a unique experience. I now know what it's like to lose someone that I deeply care for. And it only gives me empathy for all those who have lost a loved one, or those who will, which is everyone, right? And I used to balance life as there are pleasant moments and there are unpleasant ones, and that you want more of the pleasant and less of the unpleasant. And as long as you're doing that, then life is good. And now I don't see it that way. It's just this beautiful balance between pleasant and unpleasant, and one's not better than the other. It's just, this is the one that I have right now. And I was grateful to go through this experience of losing my dad without any of the aversion to the pain, to the sorrow, to the sadness. I just allowed myself to feel it. And when I was crying, I was crying. And when I was laughing, I was laughing. And there was no clinging to the one or aversion of the other. And to me, that was a beautiful experience that I feel like that's how I want my life to be. One that's more balanced and is open to whatever life's throwing my way, because I don't know what's coming next. And, that to me is what I love about Buddhism as a practice.
Beautiful, Noah. It really was. And, I think what you said about groundlessness will really resonate with a lot of the agnostics and seekers in our group, just that many of us are kind of at that point that we're becoming okay with having no ground to stand on. We don't know. And we're very authentic with that. And I think, it sounds like Buddhism is also very authentic, that it inspires you to be authentic with yourself, to get to know yourself better.
Yeah, I think it does.
Thanks again, Noah. Secular Buddhism. To all of our listeners, please check it out. You can Google it or search for it on your podcast app. It's a podcast, a website, a book, and Noah Rasheta has been with us doing this interview. Thanks again, Noah. Namaste.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate
Thank you,
you
Noah.
guys allowing me to be here with you and sharing all these thoughts. So thank you.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you. Take care, Noah.
You too. Thanks.
Bye-bye.